If you're making a rear-engine sports car, there's only really one benchmark, and that's the Porsche 911. Just how close could a 40-year-old DeLorean get? Hang around, and let's find out. The DeLorean was developed in an incredibly short time frame. Normally manufacturers would spend 6 years or more developing a new model, but the DeLorean Motor Company went from drawing board to production line in about 18 months or so, an incredibly short time. And not just that, it was also on a pretty tight budget. The car was originally intended to be mid-engined, but marketing pressures meant there needed to be room for a set of golf clubs. So the engine got bumped back over the rear axle, and then John DeLorean was staring down the barrel of the Porsche 911 in the rear-engine sports car market, a car that at that point had been honed in production over a period of almost 20 years. So it's not really a fair comparison to compare the DeLorean to a car that had 20 years more development on top of that. This, the Porsche 911 40 Jahre. 18 months versus 40 years. But it is a fun one. In 1981, the cars that the DeLorean was up against included the Chevy Corvette, which was a bit cheaper, the Ferrari 308, which was much more expensive, the Porsche 928, which was also pretty expensive, and yes, of course, the Porsche 911. In 1981, the DeLorean retailed at $25,000, a little bit less than the Porsche 911 SC's $28,000 before options. And yes, whilst the DeLorean in federal specs horsepower output of 130 may have seemed a little bit anemic compared to the 911's 172 horsepower, had the DeLorean survived long enough to be released in Europe, it would have got the European spec version of the engine that put out 160 horsepower. Now, while these outputs might not seem particularly stellar by modern standards, you have to remember this was the dark days of the early 1980s, when you could go down to your local car dealer and walk away with an Austin Allegro, or maybe if you were feeling sporty, a Triumph TR7. And if you wanted a hot hatch, the flavour du jour, the Escort XR3, pumped out a whopping 96 horsepower. So different times indeed. Anyway, for what it's worth, the DeLorean and the 911, definite 100% competitors.
There can be only one.
Well, they do look pretty different, certainly different schools of design. The DeLorean from the awesome wedge era of the 70s and into the 80s, obviously, 1981 car, and the Porsche can really trace its roots back to the sort of the aerodynamic era of the 1950s and from the 356. If you've not seen a DeLorean in the flesh before, it's quite a surprise at just how low and wide it is. It's the same height as a Lamborghini Murcielago or a Aventador and the same width as a Countach. So it was a very different shape to the contemporary 911. And the same is even true of this pairing. Surprisingly, the DeLorean is quite a lot shorter than the 911 though. The DeLorean was hammered at the time for being too heavy, and it was about 50 kilos heavier than the contemporary 911. But by modern standards, it's actually a bit of a lightweight. 1,270 kilos for the DeLorean plays 1,370 in the 40 Jahre. In terms of how they're put together, the 911 is broadly conventional, bar its rear engine. The DeLorean has stainless steel panels over a fiberglass tub. And, of course, gull-wing doors. So, not exactly conventional. In isolation, the 911 is a good-looking car. Squat, shapely, muscular. But next to the DeLorean, it's just a bit bulbous. Now, it could be argued that the DeLorean is somewhat form over function compared to the rather more ruthless German, but on balance, I think you do have to give this one to the DeLorean. So, so this isn't part of the script, but every DeLorean has its own peculiarities around starting. This one is fine from cold, it's fine from hot, but in the medium hot category, where it's just been sitting for 20 minutes, that's when it'll mess you about. Go figure. Let's be honest, the DeLorean is on a bit of a hiding to nothing here. Its 2.8 V6 in this European spec pumps out 160 horsepower, not even close to the Porsche's 3.6 litre flat six with X51 power kit lifting power to 345. The DeLorean's weight advantage can't compensate for that kind of deficit. The Porsche's gearbox is also closer spaced with an extra ratio, whereas the DeLorean's long 5-speed box is great for comfort cruising, but not so much for quarter-mile sprints. So what kind of numbers are we looking at for the DeLorean? Well, this car will get to 60 in the high 7s and top out about 135. That's actually not too bad by the standards of the early 1980s. I still want to see if I can get the car back to Santa Pod, do a few cheeky mods, and see if I can get a quarter mile under the big 16. So as long as you've not got the breathless catalysed automatic, the DeLorean will still show most average modern cars a clean pair of heels. But the Porsche whoops its ass clean off. Naught to 60 in the high 4s, top speed of 180, and a quarter mile around 13 flats. Good night. Okay, so in a straight line, the DeLorean is toast. But what about the corners? Okay, also toast. But that doesn't lead you to the conclusion you'd think it might. Hang around, I'll come back to that thought later. What a lovely little MG sprite. Anyway, corners. Here's one. The DeLorean isn't actually all that bad. It helps if you've done a few of the obvious mods, replacing the front OEM springs with ones of the correct height, polybushing the front anti-roll bar, and reinforcing the front lower control arms. Arguably, all of these would have been done by the time the car got released in Europe anyway. Like the 911, the DeLorean responds best to the slow-in, fast-out school of driving. DeLorean claimed 35-65 for the weight distribution, but the scale said it was more like 32-68. That's a lot of weight at the back, and with only 18 months to hone the chassis, it does show a little. So it's not going to let you off the hook if you come in too hot. No driver aid to save your bacon if you drive it like a cock. Tightening ones like this need care, get that speed off before, let the car settle, let the front tyres load up, and then you can push on and bury the hammer. Admittedly, maybe more of a pocket hammer. No, the DeLorean doesn't handle well by modern standards, but it is fun to drive. The 911, well, it's a 911, so you know what you're getting. Weight distribution is a little bit better than the DeLorean, only 61% of the weight at the back. That 61 does mean you've got a wodge of grip, and you do need it because it's got a lot more power. The front end is delicate and nimble in a way that the DeLorean's just isn't. Body roll, well, there's some, but the body is a lot tighter controlled than the DeLorean. You can chuck the 911 into corners in a way that in the DeLorean you just can't. It's not as riddled with electronics as modern 911s, but it does have Porsche stability management, ABS, ASC, ABC, ABCDE, FG, and that does mean it's sure-footed. Get your speed off before the corner, braking down a straight line, maybe a hint of trail, find your line, put your foot down, feel that rear end squat, that flat six rasp, and let it slingshot you out. If you've got an empty roundabout, you can chuck it in this way, swing it around the roundabout that way, come off again, really feel that body weight transferring between the different tyres. It feels like it's very tightly controlled. It feels like you can get away with that sort of behaviour. In the DeLorean, not so much. Ah, the turning circle is terrible. Where the Porsche is definitely better than the DeLorean is on wiggly little lanes like this. In the DeLorean, it's simply too wide and too vague to feel particularly confident hustling the car. The DeLorean is at its best when you've got a little bit more room.
So Jez, what's happened?
This is what's happened.
What?
So basically there's something wrong with the autostat and the fans haven't turned on.
Wait,
and essentially
in English?
The car wants to explode.
Day one, halfway through, and the DeLorean is f***ing given up. This is breakdown number one then. F***ing brilliant. Why didn't we fly, you dickhead?
Phalange attached. With the phalange attached, the DeLorean is soon back on the road, and at high speed. Still doing 125 miles an hour. The DeLorean is still in one piece. Doesn't look like it here. This is, maybe just notice how fast we go past this lorry here.
You know,
yeah.
The end of day one draws to a close.
Yeah. The list of rear-engine production cars is not a particularly long one, and the list of rear-engine sports cars is shorter still. In fact, off the top of my head, there's only one other I can think of, and that is the Renault Alpine in its various different guises. So whilst there are some fairly glaring differences between the DeLorean and the Porsche in terms of the way they drive, surely there should also be some similarities versus the rest of the motoring kingdom. Is there a through line across 40 years of development? Well, yes there is. The DeLorean doesn't have the grunt and isn't as tight a package as the Porsche, but both of these cars share the same character and intent. Yes, 4 decades of handling bumps and development mean that you can take more liberties in one car than the other, but you treat a winding road exactly the same way in both. Interestingly, the Porsche hasn't spent the time trying to hide its rear engineness. If anything, it's embraced it. It spent the time just trying to absorb some of the fruitier handling characteristics. In some ways, this is more like rear-engined Lotus prototype versus Porsche, because after all, it was Lotus who did the bulk of the engineering and chassis design for the DeLorean. Whilst it's true that the long ratios and plush ride perhaps steer the DeLorean a little bit more towards GT than pure sports car, the way that both of these cars go about involving you in the driving process comes from the same place. And for what it's worth, so does the Renault GTA, which in late 80s naturally aspirated form, admittedly the only version I've actually driven, feels a little bit like a tighter, lighter, smoother DeLorean. Perhaps 25% of the way from the DeLorean to the Porsche. So coming back to the thoughts I started this section with. In a car as fast as the Porsche, if you've got anybody else in the car with you, 7/10 is just too fast. So it's not like you can actually enjoy it with anyone. And even if you're in the car by yourself, it's still so fast it doesn't leave you with a lot of room to avoid the kind of random nonsense that happens on the public road. But in the DeLorean, 7/10 happens at about half the speed. So when your passenger moans, you can just say, well, we're only doing 40. And whilst the brakes have the exciting propensity to lock the front wheels up should you stamp on the pedal hard, you'll still be stopping a lot sooner than if you'd been driving a faster car. Just a quick word on how high the limits are in modern cars. I've been in some fairly fast cars driven by some fairly fast drivers, but the most extreme experience I had was at Weissach for the launch of the, at the time, new Porsche 991 GT3. I was doing some filming and I thought, you know what, I'll just hop in the passenger seat with my camera, get a few detail shots, you know, hand on, actually it wasn't a gear stick because it's flappy paddles, hands on steering wheel, those sorts of things. Anyway, I get in with the test driver and he sets off, and within about 9 seconds, I'd realised that any hope I had of filming was completely out of the window. It was just going to have to be done on the GoPros I'd already mounted on the car. I put the camera on the floor and I just held on. I have never experienced anything like it. Approaching corners thinking there is simply no way that any vehicle can go around this corner, and then somehow it did. Genuinely, utterly brain melting. So if you buy a Porsche 991 GT3, how are you ever really going to explore the limits? How are you ever really going to find just how amazing the car is at the edge of traction when it starts giving you the feedback you need to enjoy it? The answer is you can't. You've got to go to a track. And that's kind of the same for any fast car made in the last 20 years. And that's what you get with a car like the DeLorean. It gives you that sense of being seat of your pants while still driving at a speed that'll have you holding up caravans. So anyway, back to the matter at hand. On a purely subjective fun level, there'd be an argument for calling this a draw. Both of these cars offer a visceral, analog, tactile, involving driving experience that modern cars can't hope to come close to. But as soon as you include even an ounce of objectivity, that does rather swing it in the direction you'd expect. As for packaging, it is true that the odd modern car chooses the rear engine layout as a way to improve interior space, but generally speaking, there's a reason why most conventional cars stick their engine in the front. The space required for the radiator, steering rack, brake and clutch reservoirs and the rest of it means that the front is generally less effective as a boot space than the back. And what that means for these two cars is that when it comes to the frunk space, you either have to go shallow or you have to go deep. And what about the interior? Well, the Porsche makes the most of its extra dimensions by having space in the back for 2 humans at a squeeze, as opposed to the DeLorean, which has room for just the one. I'm in. No, I'm not. Both cars were intended to be luxury sports cars. But how well do they fit that brief? Well, the DeLorean certainly attempted to be well appointed. Leather seats, air conditioning, electric windows. Let's have a little look. This is how a 40-year-old electric window motor works when it's trying to push the glass back up. Let's give it a go. You can do it. Eventually. There was even a tape deck. Admittedly, that has been replaced with something slightly more modern and an oil pressure gauge that these days only works when it feels like it. It is a strict 2-seater. I'm in. I'm not. But for a car this low, there's actually quite a lot of room. You could even fit perhaps a bendy Labrador in the footwell with you. As for downsides, well, it does smell a bit the way old cars do. Not entirely sure what it is. Is it the glue that holds things together? Is it the soundproofing that protects you from the engine rumbling away just behind your head? Or maybe the wood that's underneath the carpet in here? Not really sure. And it does feel a bit like a kit car in terms of build quality. And maybe that's not so surprising because that's essentially what it was. 9,000 mass-produced, hand-built prototypes, each coming off the assembly line a little bit different. And what about the Porsche? Well, electric windows, heated seats, climate control, CD multi-changer, amplifier, Alcantara headlining, interior orientation lighting, electric sunroof, cup holders, annoying power release for luggage compartment and engine lid. The genius of the 9962, where if you get a flat battery, you can't open the frunk to get to the battery. But on the plus side, the oil pressure gauge does work. And it also does feel like it's been screwed together by a crack team of German robots. Let's just see how this door sounds. Solid thunk. And what about the DeLorean? Well, for optimum closing, there is a knack to it. Hand on the back of the bolster. A little bit of a crunch in there, perhaps, along with the clunk. There is one surprising but to this. The DeLorean seats might look basic, but they're more comfortable than the Porsches. All other things being equal, I'd rather spend 3 hours on the motorway in that seat than the 911's sporty but a touch too firm shoulder huggers. Still, clearly, it's not enough to swing it. The 911 has always been regarded as a usable sports car, daily driver even. Pick your kids up from school, go to work, do the shopping, no problem. It's got a pair of back seats, a useful space behind them, decent storage in the frunk, it won't break down, and it'll do 30 mpg on a run. In the bag, you say? Well, not so fast. You can fit a surprising amount of crap in the DeLorean, and contrary to the myth, you can actually open the gull-wing doors in much less space than a regular car. So this block of wood represents the car parked next to you in the multi-storey car park. Conventional wisdom would say that you'd have no chance of getting out. Let's find out. Amazing. It's super long geared with a plush ride, so cruising on the motorway is pretty comfortable. And surprisingly for an old car, it's not even that much of a guzzler, so it's not an entirely preposterous idea to go on long trips in it. People even let you out at junctions. And because it's built out of bits that went into old Cortinas and Renaults, parts are a lot cheaper than the 911. From next year, the DeLorean will be classed as a historic vehicle, so no road tax or MOT. But, and there are a few buts, with the best will in the world, it's not going to be as reliable as a Porsche less than half its age. You don't really want to leave it on the street. It'll probably leak next time it rains really hard. Those gull-wing doors seem to catch a lot of water in the sills that then leak down into the cabin. There's no power steering, and considering that the front wheels only have to turn, not drive the car, the turning circle is terrible. It absolutely hates speed bumps. Oh. It is a rear-engined car designed in the 1970s, so on a hot day in summer, in a tailback or behind perhaps a truck like this at paralyzingly slow speeds, don't be surprised to see your temperature gauge start to soar alarmingly. Does it have the grunts for it? No. No, it doesn't have the grunt. One downside of the DeLorean on roads like this, stuck behind slow-moving traffic, being sat on the left-hand side of the car does mean you either have to try and grab a view up the inside or swing out so wide to take a look, it's a little bit fruity. One thing about the stainless is that it acts like a magnet. People simply have to touch it to see what it feels like. Kids are the worst and will finger it mercilessly. You'll be forever washing it to get rid of the grease. Which one's the better call for a trip to the shops? It's probably going to be the 911, isn't it? Road trip? That's a slightly closer call because the DeLorean's a good cruiser, but ultimately I think the better ventilation and space you've got in the 911 swings it. Hey ho. So, looks like another one for the 911. Now look, let's be honest, this is the only category that actually matters. The rest are all just hot air. This is a tough space for the 911. Maybe you'll get the slightly odd character sidling up to you in the pub and boring your tits off with stories of their air-cooled rebuild. But for everybody else, it's sad to say it, you're a dick. How do those conversations go? Hi, so what do you drive? Oh, well, you know, I've got like a
A Porsche.
Well, you mean like one of those new little snazzy McCann things?
No, it's like a 911.
There is just no world in which anybody wants to hear that. Well, admittedly, it does take you twice as long to fill up with fuel because as soon as you've pulled up, someone's come over for a chat. And as soon as you've opened the door and got out, someone else has hopped in because they're so excited they're desperate for a photo in it. But that's cool, right? Because it's making people happy. I mean, by driving a DeLorean, you are quite literally spreading the joy. Such is the disparity here that normal scoring doesn't really apply. So in summary, the 911 went faster and handled better than the DeLorean in 1981. So it's not hugely surprising that 23 years later, it still does, and by a rather larger margin. But that's not really the point. The point is that rear-engine six-cylinder cars are the dogs. I'll leave it to you to decide which has the bigger pair. Until next time, where we're going, we don't need MOTs.